So while Canon and Nikon are desperately looking for new ways to give up market share, Sony's giving away free intervalometers. Hello YouTube, my name is Matt Spaugh and I am a photographer, videographer, and recent recipient of what might be the worst haircut I've ever paid good money for. Today's video is about time lapses, and what sparked my desire to do it was the fact that Sony recently did a firmware update to their A-series full-frame cameras. Now those cameras include an internal intervalometer. If you're not familiar with that term, an intervalometer allows you to shoot a specific number of frames at a specific interval. You can then take all those, stitch them back together, and each one of those frames becomes the individual frames of a video. So if I want to shoot 24 frame per second video and I want a 10-second time lapse, I need to shoot 240 frames. The camera will now take care of all the logistics of that, and it's really nice. Prior to this update, you either had to use an external intervalometer or you could use the S&Q mode that's built into Sony cameras. And that S&Q mode is pretty cool, but it doesn't allow the flexibility that you're going to have if you're using still images. First of all, if I shoot raw still images, I have a ton of post-processing options that I can use. Second of all, I get a 6K file when I'm done. So even if my ultimate product is 4K, I still have some leeway to do some pan, scan, zoom, things like that without losing quality. So I'm going to try to, in this video, walk through all the steps of using this camera and my lens to create nice looking time lapses. Let's get to work. The first thing that we need to talk about in our time lapse are the practical considerations. So location and framing, the settings for your camera, and lens selection. I'm going to try to cram all of this into one segment. So it's a lot of information, but it should give you the basics of what you need to make decisions based on your equipment and the time lapse that you're going to shoot. I'm going to shoot today at the expressway near my house. So that's going to give me some really obvious compositional cues. I'm going to have a road, and that road's going to come from me to a converging point on the horizon. So those are referred to as leading lines. Those leading lines create interest. I'm going to have a horizon, which is going to give me something to place in the frame, either centered or maybe on one of the rule of thirds lines where you're dividing everything into 3 segments. So all the basic compositional cues that you would use in any photograph or video, of course, come into play here. But you have an additional consideration, and that's movement. For my example, I'm going to have cars that are moving fast, and I'm going to have clouds that are moving slow. I really like to have multiple things moving at different speeds in my time lapses if I can. And if with any luck today, they'll be moving in opposite directions. It's a good day weather-wise for me because it is cloudy but not overcast. I'm going to shoot late in the day, 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I'll have a blue sky with nice white puffy clouds. There's a little bit of wind, so I'm going to get some movement out of there. Let's talk about settings. Camera settings for shutter speed. Normally I would try to slow my shutter speed down a little bit and get a little bit of blur in those images to smooth things out. Because it's so bright out, I'm probably going to end up at about a 50th of a second. The only things you need to really remember are your shutter speed cannot exceed whatever the interval is between your frames. Obviously, everything I'm going to shoot today, I'll shoot at 1 frame per second. So I can't have a shutter speed longer than 1 second. They would overlap. I'm going to have to adjust it for the conditions, but in my opinion, I would not go any faster than 1/50th of a second, and if you can go slower, you're likely to get a little bit smoother movement depending on what you're shooting. For aperture, I'll be at f/22. I do not have an ND filter for the lens that I'm using, so I've got to close that thing down as far as it will go because of how bright it is outside. The upside of that is it's going to keep everything basically in focus, which is what I want. So small aperture, reasonable shutter speed, ISO falls wherever it falls. I'm guessing today I'll be at 100. The last thing to remember is that you need to shoot in manual mode. You do not want your camera making decisions for you in between frames, deciding that it wants to focus on something else, deciding that it wants to change aperture. So stay in manual mode and you'll be safe. Last thing to talk about in this section is the lens. I like to use wide lenses for these. This is the Rokinon 14mm f2.8. I picked it up used locally. I think I paid about 200 bucks for it. Even if I had paid full price for this, I don't think I would feel ripped off like I do on this haircut that I got. It's a sharp lens, it's manual lens, but it's the right tool for the job. Now that we have our lens selected, here's a quick run through of the intervalometer settings that are built into the camera now. If we go to menu and we are on tab 1, you're going to go to page 4, and the second option down is intervalometer shoot function. Say OK. We're going to turn interval shooting on, of course. Back out of there. Shooting start time. This allows you to set a time delay between when you press the shutter button for the first time and when your time-lapse images actually start shooting. So we don't need that. We'll leave it at 1 second. The shooting interval is the time between frames. I'm going to do all mine today at 1 second. Nice function here. It will tell you the shooting time based on the number of shots that you've plugged in. So you can kind of calculate how long you're going to have to sit outside. Back to menu. Next is the number of shots, and you can change this up or down as you need to. We're going to go with 240. AE tracking sensitivity. If you're shooting JPEGs, this function will allow the camera to make compensation for your exposure over the course of your time lapse. Could be handy if you're doing a sunset or sunrise, something like that, where the exposure conditions in your frame are going to change drastically. For manual mode, I don't believe this does anything, but I would probably leave this on low. Going to the next page, silent shoot in intervalometer. You can turn off the shutter sound. All right, I've got everything packed up and ready to go. My camera, lens, tripod, put on my hat to save the world from having to look at this bad haircut. I'm probably not gonna shoot any video while I'm over there. My camera is gonna be dedicated to doing the stills. So next time you see me, we'll be on the desktop and we'll start doing the post-processing. Hey, I have returned safely from my excursion to the side of the road, which brings up a point. Don't get so caught up in the creative process or in keeping track of your settings that you lose track of what's going on around you. It's your responsibility to keep yourself safe while you're doing this kind of work, and just don't do dumb things. All right, I have put my SD card in and I've copied the Sony native RAW files in here. These are ARW files. When Adobe adopted its subscription-based pricing, I adopted Affinity Photo. If you are looking for an alternative and want to break free from the shackles of your Adobe overlords, by all means do yourself a favor and look at Affinity Photo. All that said, Affinity Photo has a shortcoming in that it cannot batch process RAW files yet. I have talked to them on a number of occasions, and evidently that's coming, but it's not there yet. So I have to keep Photoshop CS6 around, which is kind of a bummer. But there's another problem in that Photoshop CS6 doesn't play well with ARW files. Matter of fact, it doesn't play with them at all. So the first thing we have to do is convert these ARW files to DNG files. And for that, we have the Adobe Digital Negative Converter. This is super simple. It's free. I'll link it below. You select the folder where your ARW files are. You select a folder where you want to put the DNG files. If you want to make some changes to the name or the file extension, you can. You hit convert, and when it's done, it gives you a folder full of DNG files. These can now be processed in Photoshop. So I'm going to select all. I'm going to drag those into Photoshop. I'm going to apologize in advance for the fan noise because this thing is definitely going to start blowing hard. Now that I'm into Camera Raw 9.11, the first of my 240 files is selected. I've already made some adjustments here, and once you get an image that you're happy with, select all, synchronize. This is all the settings that I have made changes to, and quite a few more. When you click OK, it will apply whatever settings you've done to that first image to all the others. So I say OK, and we can see it is thinking about that, and as we scroll on down to the bottom, boom, it's done. We do not want to open those images. We want to save these images. Click Save Images. You can pick a location to put them. I'm not going to make any changes to the file name. The format we want is JPEG. And I'm going with a quality of 10, which is probably a little bit high for this purpose, but it works. You would click Save at this point. I've already done the heavy lifting here, and that process is done. And what we have now are the processed files. So here are all of our JPEGs ready to go into Final Cut Pro. Now that we have all of our JPEGs ready to go, we are going to go to Final Cut Pro. The first thing we need to do is create a new library. We're going to call this Timelapse Test. And now we need to import our media. We click Import Media, navigate to the Processed Files folder, select all, and hit Import. Now we can see that all the JPEG files are here ready for us to do something with them. To do that, we need to create a project, and we'll just call that Timelapse 1. I'm going to go 1080p at 24 frames per second. You do want to set these. Don't use the automatic settings because these are not 1080p files. And now we can select all of our images, simply drag them into the timeline. By default, when you bring these in, Final Cut Pro gives each of them a duration of, I believe it's 10 seconds. And so we need to change that duration. With them all selected, I can right click here and say change duration. You can see here my time code has now gone blue. If I push 1, it's going to take each one of those and make it a single frame. So I hit return, it does that math for me. If I push Shift and Z, it'll open this up to kind of fill the available space. Now I want to create a clip out of that. And we're going to do a compound clip. Say OK. And Final Cut has stitched them all together, and here come the fans again. So what we have now is this 3:2 ratio image in here. I could have shot these 16:9 and probably should have, but I knew that I was planning to do some manipulation to this once it was in. I want to do a couple of things. I'm going to slide to the beginning of my clip, and I'm going to scale it up to get rid of these black lines on the side. That scale is 120. I'm then going to make an adjustment on the y-axis, and I'm going to set keyframes for both of those parameters by clicking this little diamond here off to the right. I then want to go to the end, zoom in on this, but try to keep the horizon about where it is. So I can set another scale keyframe, go to 135, and you can see our horizon line has dropped. So if I set a keyframe for the horizon line, I can bring that back up, and we should be about where we were. Looks like it's changing. It's going a little bit too high. There we go. So what we have now, and again it's jerky, but you can tell it's zooming in just slightly over the course of the clip, and that horizon line is staying about where it was. So that kind of takes care of how to create your clip from your still images. I know this has been a lot of information and a lot of steps, but hopefully you're able to fast forward, rewind, pause as you need to, and pick it up. If you have some questions, feel free to post them in the comments down below. I will be glad to try to help as I can. If you're better at this than me and you know a better way to do it, by all means share that in the comments as well. This is about a mutual sharing of information. One thing I hope my channel inspires is a desire in viewers to try something new. And it's a huge part of why I started this channel. I wanted to help viewers learn, but I also wanted to learn what it would take for me to produce these videos on a regular basis at a production level that I felt like was acceptable. And it's worked. And I learned something every single time. By way of encouragement, your time lapses are not always going to work. There's a lot of technical aspects to this, and there's a lot of things that you just don't have any control over. I recently had a job for a customer where I needed the sunrise coming up over their building as a nice establishing shot. I went out there at least a dozen mornings before sunrise before I got something that I was even remotely happy with. It's the kind of thing where you just have to persevere and do your best to not get frustrated over the process. I hope all this has been helpful. I hope that you'll hang around the channel and subscribe. Take a look at some of my other videos while you're here. Ring my bell, tell 2 friends, give me a comment down below if I've really botched something or if you like what you see. And we'll see you soon.